All right, everybody, thank you so much. I really appreciate our first speaker for setting the tone and getting us in touch with our body. I'll just kind of redirect and pivot a little bit to the mind, but we actually are in synchronicity, so it'll work out very well. So anyways, my name is Sandra Osazuwa, and I'm a fourth-year doctoral candidate enrolled in the clinical and counseling psychology over at UOttawa, University of Toronto. And I'm excited to present a part of my master's dissertation. And I'm gonna have to speed through this because I thought I had a little bit more time. So just here's an outline of what I'm gonna talk about today, but I'll jump right into it. So as many of us have come to know within our research or practice or just our lived experiences, and probably what you've heard about or will hear about within this conference, when we talk or we look at what's reflected in the literature about the Black community's interactions with the Western mental health system, there's a historical trend in service underutilization despite the pressing need for support and care. Several factors contribute to this underutilization. So you have cultural stigma, you have ambivalence about the effectiveness of treatments, you have financial limitations, and then also group clinical mistrust, which is, rightfully so. As we examine the situation, we're witnessing a noticeable shift in the field of applied psychology and research towards multiculturalism. This renewed focus has led us to the exploration of more culturally responsive approaches to mental health treatments. And this presents a unique opportunity for us to consider the potential use of ancestral healing systems to address mental health disparities related to access, engagement, and overall outcomes found within the Black community. By drawing upon our own rich cultural heritage and traditional healing practices, we can find renewed hope for developing more effective interventions. And so while this new pathway appears to be a great approach for meeting the needs of underserved folk where they are at, there's a few factors that we need to be aware of before we can jump right in. So while some groups might have an easier time returning to these ancestral practices, the post-colonial and critical race theory perspectives, they give us some factors that we really need to consider when we plan to specifically cater to the Black community. They prompt us to consider the colonial approach or the colonial history of Africa and the West, the relationship, what has been acquired, what has been lost on both sides, the prevalence of cultural hegemony, the hierarchies, and anti-Black racism on a macro and a micro level. And that ultimately has a hand in determining which worldviews get lifted, which ones get degraded. And it also reminds us that the effects of colonization are lasting and internalized by the descendants. And that's true for those on the continent and then also in the diaspora. And these effects are ongoing and they're exacerbated by factors like racism, white supremacy, and the dominance of Westernization. So with the desire to mitigate further inequities against already an underserved population or community, my focus for my master's dissertation was the question, how might Canada's African descendants respond to psychotherapeutic efforts that aim to culturally integrate African healing traditions and Western systems? So in the next few slides, I'll talk about my research design, and I'll briefly give an overview of a summary of the findings that I had, which there's a QR code and it'll pop up again later on in the presentation. So if you want to find that paper, and then from there, I'll contextualize the recommendations that were given to me because it was a qualitative interview format by the participants who took part in the study. So just to kind of lay the groundwork, I have a couple of definitions. So in terms of African community or descendants in this particular research, it talks about the Black African diasporic population segment that self-identify as having direct ancestral ties to the continent, so African immigrants, first-generation Afro-Canadians, multi-generation African Canadians. We excluded Afro-Caribbean people from this particular research just because they have their own set of healing traditions, and we wanted to acknowledge that. My supervisor has already done some research around that. So just to keep things kind of clean, for this study, we just decided to, zero in. African healing traditions, we use a pretty broad definition to respect the subjectivity of the concept. And that allowed participants to talk about what it meant to them and really capture that understanding. And then African traditional religions, we acknowledge that it's separate, but overlaps with African healing traditions. And so we just kept that in mind moving forward. And then there's the definition of integrative psychotherapy as per psychology tends to define it. So in terms of how we went about discovering our research question, we used constructivist grounded theory approach. We conducted semi-structured interviews. They last between 1.5 to 2 hours with 10 participants. And these were conducted remotely during the pandemic. And they received $15 honorarium of their time. We recruited mostly within the GTA because they had the largest Black population. Were people who have West or Southern African ancestry. And again, we made this decision to kind of narrow in on the population, and just because that reflects the ancestry of myself and my supervisor. So, and also these are the regions where most of the research, a lot of the research is done in terms of ancestral systems. So it just made sense to go from that approach. And then also, we also talked about, or we prioritized people who had received or attempted to receive Western services, just so they had comparisons to talk about. But we also included people who said that they have not done that, because we recognize that's a very valid thing within our community. And in those cases, we just asked what were the reasons that they never attempted or used these services. And so the different participants, they varied in age, sex, citizen status, and so on. So there was just a different range of perspectives and experiences that kind of formed these opinions. So in terms of how I did the interviews, we started by laying the foundation of talking about what their conceptualizations of African healing traditions were. And then from there, we talked about their experiences or lack thereof with the Western mental health system. And then from there, that's how we got to our questions about the integration of the two, their attitudes, their concerns, possible solutions, and here we are in terms of talking about the framework recommendations. And so within this presentation, I will briefly talk about some of the things that they discuss. So yeah, that's what this is about. So just to kind of preference, I'll just give a really brief overview of the first study that I did and the results that came out of it, just to provide some context. So overall, the participants were really receptive to the idea of having an integrative approach, as it would be educational and really sensitive to their cultural needs. They identified some challenges, such as community engagement, clinician competency, and the narrative, and being able to control the narrative. And it really talked about the need for internal and external work. So internal work within the community, such as calling for education, investment, and the allocation of resources at a communal and a personal level. And that involved empowering the community through improved knowledge translation efforts and creating infrastructure and fostering cultural acknowledgement and humility. And then externally, there was a need to address systemic and societal issues that act as deterrents for this integrative process. And that requires efforts to challenge and dismantle cultural hegemony, hierarchies, and anti-Black racism, also promoting representation, involving the voices of diverse people, and addressing power dynamics to perpetuate Western dominance and the commodification of African healing traditions. So if you want, you can read up on that a little bit more, but I'll go into what they actually recommended. So when I asked these participants to describe the ideal intervention that they would be looking for in terms of this integrative approach, a lot of them had these similar things to talk about. So there was a strong consensus that it should be delivered with holistic and collectivistic informed orientations. So for example, one person elaborated on this idea by explaining, it really depends on what the person is seeking, that seeking healing would be comfortable with, and what their personal boundaries are when it comes to something like this. It would have to be holistic in nature, because that's not going to be a one-size-fits-all, and it won't address all of the client's mental health issues. Another participant talked about African indigenous healing systems, understand healing as a more collective effort. So you're not going to go to one counselor Just like if you have cancer, you would go to a specific doctor for that cancer. Healing is holistic, and having a clear identity is affirmed by a lot of institutions. It's in itself healing. So while there are different perspectives on how best to support healing, one thing remain clear. All participants strongly emphasize the value of using complementary tools, approaches that align with the individual needs of the client rather than enforcing rigid one-size-fits-all methods. So one participant said, the benefits that a client is able to walk away with as many tools as possible for them to heal and fix what's going on in their lives is the benefit. Another benefit is the therapist or the healer is not feeling lacking in their own practice. The other benefit is a sense of community, which is intrinsic and necessary for Black people. So I think those are the benefits, and it can only help us all in terms of what we need to do and what we're called to do within our purposes on this earth. So all the participants agreed on the importance of integrating culturally informed components into education around African knowledge. They highlighted this as a really important aspect of fostering a deeper understanding and appreciation for African healing traditions in both the clients and the practitioners. So two people who had limited prior knowledge about African healing traditions, they reflected on some of the potential discomfort that people might feel. One person said at least starting with the spread of information would be a step in the right direction of being okay with it. Another person said just having a basic understanding of or definition of it, I think will be very helpful. Some people may be uncomfortable, some may not. For some, it will resonate. For some people, you may need to assess and build rapport first. But when you see that they do believe in what your standard definition of traditional healing is, at that point, you can possibly bring it up. Also, in addition to the previous insights, many people talked about the importance of oral lore and the arts, and that's an important vehicle for conveying messages and cultural knowledge. And they highlighted the use of stories, fables, folktale music, poetry, serve as powerful tools to transmit knowledge across generations. So for instance, one person said Africans love stories. It doesn't matter within the North, the South, East, West. It's something that's there. It's good for cultural knowledge purposes. And of course, to make sure the culture doesn't die, just to keep spreading it down by oral history. And the idea was further echoed by someone who said, the use of stories is very important, especially when we talk about the belief systems and how it teaches a certain doctrine. And I think it's a beautiful thing about African diaspora is whether you are continental or whether you're of the diaspora, almost all of us has heard about Nancy the spider. And so some of these folk tales are our first step into HT-related knowledge. And then lastly, the practitioner's ability to offer a mindful, explorative, and flexible clinical approach was mentioned by all the participants as an ideal component. This involved considering the client's background, their personal knowledge systems, remaining mindful of the pacing of the information, so what and how and when it's introduced, as well as being generally interested in the clients and their progress throughout the healing journey. So one person said, by including the client's own exposure to things and their life experiences in a way, clinicians are starting to acknowledge that they're human beings, they exist. They have their own interests. When the client starts with baby steps, integrating everyday things, this person now feels like they have control instead of someone else trying to control them. And then another person mentioned, what I see is almost like not necessarily a rigid framework, but this open exploration of what works and what may not work depending on the issue. I think it's just creating space for people to explore on their own with just questions. And I feel if someone has a basic understanding of African Indigenous healing approaches, they might be able to be more of a guide, more of an accompanying person. So this is a summary of all I just talked about. And I had a couple things to wrap up, but I think we could stop there. But if you have any questions or if you want more information, contact information, and thank you for listening.